Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We'll be picking up this time where we left off last time, looking at chalices. Inauspicious, all-encompassing Holy Chalice of the Deep Ancillary Tombs. One of the all-encompassing Holy Chalices that breaks the seals in various places in the underground ruins. This inauspicious one calls an inauspicious bell by means of a ritual. The bell-ringing woman is likely a Tumerian mad maid. The ancillary tombs are areas of tombs and death of little ritual significance. They are also a nest for dangerous poisonous snakes and venomous insects. Note, the additive rite, inauspicious bell, is for online use. A bell-ringing woman will not appear offline. So, this chalice introduces us to some differences in the typical template by virtue of being a sinister, or inauspicious, chalice. I like to think of it as the sinister variant, because as we'll see after we've collected a few more chalices, all the ones that have sinister in their names share two sets of lines. One in the base item description about summoning a bell and a mad Tumerian, and one that serves as a note added at the end to make sure that players know that this sinister functionality will only work when playing the game online. Other than those variants though, we've seen most of the text used here before in the standard template for root chalices. There's the opening line about breaking multiple labyrinth seals, and the standard set of lines used to describe the Hintertombs as a region that every Hintertomb chalice except for the first one uses. That makes this a fairly standard and straightforward item to look at, except for one or two relatively small things I think it's worth going into. Let's start with the name of the item. Funnily enough, it looks to me like there's a typo here, both in the official English and the original Japanese, that I want to go into because I think it helps reveal a bit more of the logic behind the chalice naming conventions. So, by now, we've seen that these chalice names are kind of modular. There's the base name for a chalice that's determined by its region, like the Root Chalice. Then, there's a term that specifies how far down in a region a given chalice will take you. So we have the Central Root and Lower Root Chalices, although this information is left out of the initial chalice, presumably because it's always the closest to the surface. Beyond that, there's the question of whether or not this is a root chalice. Each depth of chalice has its own corresponding root chalice, so we have the Root Chalice, the Central Root Chalice, and the Lower Root Chalice. And finally, we have the sinister version we've just discovered, but the sinister descriptor never alters any of the other descriptors included in the chalice names. As is the case with all of these modifying factors, it's simply added on to the base names that have already been established. I think this is done to tie into another theme of these chalice dungeons that the game text hints at when it refers to additional, or additive, rites. The idea is that you have a base chalice that you are then able to alter and add things to by means of various rituals to access greater depths or to receive greater rewards in exchange for higher difficulty. That's something of a different point though. To get back to the main issue here, note that the term consistently used in the Japanese for a lower region is fukaki, while in the specific case of this chalice, the final ki that should follow the kanji for deep or lower is missing. This is a pretty minor typo in the Japanese, especially since the kanji that has the meaning of deep or lower is still present, but it does seem to be a break in the pattern that we can see if we look ahead at the names of the other sinister chalices. Perhaps as a result, the official English term for this chalice seems not to have included the term lower here at all. As we can see from the Sinister Lower Root Chalice, this item name should probably be the Sinister Lower Hintertomb Root Chalice. Again, this doesn't strike me as a huge problem, but I think addressing it does help illustrate the thinking behind the chalice naming conventions. And speaking of which, there's one other chalice, kind of an exceptional one, I think we should look at next. All-encompassing Holy Chalice of Abbreviated Style Ritual. One of the all-encompassing Holy Chalices that breaks the seals in various places in the underground ruins. The filled-up glass Holy Chalice is used in an abbreviated style ritual, and can quickly search for and participate in a Holy Chalice dungeon. It cannot be used in a ritual that utilizes typical materials. Also, the abbreviated style ritual can be performed at the simple altar. So, the thing that jumps out at me the most here is right in the name of the item, where my more literal rendering speaks of an abbreviated style ritual as opposed to the official short ritual. Now, I'll admit up front that the distinction between these two renderings is pretty small, but it's one that I want to bring up because of my own experience with this item and how I think it illustrates the way players may sometimes parse things differently than any given translator. First, though, let's take a look at the actual set of Japanese terms involved here, ryakushiki and gishiki. Now, the latter term is pretty straightforward. Gishiki pretty much just means ritual. It's the use of the former term, ryakushiki, where things get interesting. My Daijisen Japanese dictionary has this as a simplified way of doing things made possible by omitting a part of the full process. In other words, the ritual that is being performed with this item is a simplified one, made possible by leaving out aspects of a full chalice ritual. This is supported by how the chalice is described as functioning. We're told that this particular chalice is made of glass, presumably unlike the other chalices, and that this glass chalice cannot be used with any of the traditional ritual materials. Instead, an abbreviated ritual is performed with this chalice when it's full. This shorter ritual is done at a specific altar and grants a hunter a unique way of accessing the chalice dungeons. I spell all this out because in my own experience, calling this chalice the short Ritual Root Chalice was a little confusing. Granted, I found every aspect of a chalice dungeons confusing, but I was also unsure what to make of the item name linguistically. At first, I didn't realize it was the rituals this chalice was used in that were being described as short. I thought it was a term describing the chalice itself. Fortunately, this issue gets clarified in the item description itself, where this chalice is said to be used in a short ritual to quickly create and join a chalice dungeon. But even then, I was left unsure why this item could only be used at one specific altar, why it was not for use in a ritual using standard materials, or why this simple ritual wasn't good enough for every chalice dungeon. As soon as I saw the Japanese item name with its ryakushiki gishiki, or abbreviated style ritual, things got a lot clearer for me. An abbreviated ritual meant that leaving out materials and this process not letting you create your own chalice dungeons made sense. I still didn't get the bit about the altar, but as a whole, it's a lot clearer. That said, I'm not arguing here that short Ritual Root Chalice is a bad translation. Once I understood the idea it was meant to convey, I could see how it functioned to do just that. Translation, like any other bit of language, relies in part on the understanding of the person taking it in to function properly. But let's move on. Deep Sea, one of the Carol runes that serve as phonetic representations of inhuman voices, given the meaning of deep sea from its resemblance to sinking down deep, increases resistance to an outbreak of madness for the one who memorizes it. Large volumes of water are a severance protecting sleep, and therefore are portents of holy mystery. All ye who search, seek out what lies beyond. So, we've looked at a number of Carol runes up to this point, and by now you may have noticed that like with the chalices, there are differing degrees of through lines in how they're written. They're not quite as formulaic as the chalices, but there are certain expressions that get reused to tie them together. Now, nowhere is this as clear as in what seems to be two sets of runes, the Lake runes and the Deep Sea runes, and I thought now would be a good opportunity to look at these two groups in more detail, since they all share certain lines. Since we've just seen a translation comparison of the first Deep Sea rune, let's talk about that set first. There are 4 Deep Sea runes: Deep Sea, Clear Deep Sea, Stunning Deep Sea, and Great Deep Sea. In the official English translation, each one of these runes has exactly the same description. This is largely true of the Japanese as well, with one small exception. In the official English text, none of these runes say which conditions they increase resistance to, while in the Japanese, each one of these conditions is spelled out. You may have noticed that my more literal version of the Deep Sea rune spoke of increasing resistance to an outbreak of madness, which is a reference to the frenzy mechanic, while the official version simply notes that this rune grants augmented resistance, without spelling out what that resistance is to. This is why the Japanese item descriptions are all slightly different. They use the same text in all 4 cases, except each specifies what type of resistance is augmented: frenzy, slow poison, rapid poison, and all types, respectively. Now, this information isn't completely lost in the official English. Each of these runes features a quick description where the resistance type is specified, but it still results in a slight difference between the official English and the official Japanese versions. Speaking of which, there's actually another discrepancy here that doesn't copy quite as well. I believe I've mentioned before that there are 2 main variations for the initial line of any given rune's item description. One identifies a rune as a secret symbol left by Carol, while the other simply points out that this is a Carol rune that describes inhuman voices. These runes, for some reason, seem to do both. The opening line is the official one used for the Japanese text about a symbol left by Carol, even though the actual Japanese phrase follows the opposite pattern. But then for no reason that I can see, the official translation speaks of this transcription of the Great One's inhuman voices. Even the formatting of the double line breaks is different, which may not be significant, but suggests to me that this may be another instance of updated text that didn't get the same treatment in both languages. But now let's take a brief look at the lake runes for some contrast. There are 5 different lake runes: Lake, Arcane Lake, Fading Lake, Dissipating Lake, and Great Lake. Here, in both the official English and the Japanese, the text is largely the same, except for when it describes the form of protection those who memorize it enjoy. Also, while the English text still includes the line about being a transcription of the Great One's inhuman voices, the opening line in the English matches the Japanese. So neither of the discrepancies in the Deep Sea runes are in the Lake runes. This makes me less sure why the quick descriptions were used to differentiate the Deep Sea runes, but let's conclude on a point of unity. All 9 of these runes end with the same text, perfectly fitting for defensive runes that feature large bodies of water. Not like this one. Leftward spiraling altered form. One of the secret letters left by copyist Carol, student of Bergenworth. This twisting cross was given the meaning of altered form. This leftward spiraling one has an effect increasing stamina. The discovery of blood brought them the dream of evolution. The sickly or possibly perverse change of form is known as the first step towards that. Okay, so there are a number of things I'd like to point out about this rune in relatively short order, starting with its name. Actually, there are a few things about this naming choice that I think are notable. First, the decision to use anti-clockwise is one that I find fitting on 2 different levels. For one thing, the decision to use a common English method for describing rotational motion makes for a much better fit than the more literal leftward spiraling. Of course, the standard American phrasing would have been counterclockwise instead of anti-clockwise, but that's another translation choice that I think fits in nicely with an established pattern of leaning more towards British English as opposed to American. Already in this series, I've talked about colloquialisms like half-cut to mean drunk, or all over the shop to mean everywhere, that as an American English speaker I was unable to interpret properly. That's not even to mention the general usage of UK accents for voiced lines. Clearly, leaning more towards a non-US version of English was a priority for this particular localization, and as I've said before, I think that happens to fit Bloodborne's setting quite nicely. And speaking of things that fit nicely with Bloodborne, there's also the second half of the name for this rune to discuss, Metamorphosis. The Japanese term has a number of meanings here. One is associated with natural metamorphosis, such as when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Another denotes a simple change of form, but still others refer to less positive things, such as physical or sexual abnormalities. It's a term with a lot of complex associations, not all of them good, but the English equivalent of metamorphosis I think is a good match. Not only does it cover the same natural transformation, but it also has some similar creepy connotations. The very first definition listed in Merriam-Webster is change of physical form, structure, or substance, especially by supernatural means. And of course, I know I can't help but associate the word with the famous story by Franz Kafka. In other words, it's a similarly complex term that involves an appropriate set of connotations. You can see why that final set of lines might refer to excesses and deviations that follow metamorphosis, though I do wish those English lines were a bit more direct about the perceived connection to evolution here. But that's a point I think I'll make in more detail next time. Until then, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.